This lecture focuses on small kingdoms and mighty empires in the Near East, circa 1100 to 513 BC. After the reign of Ramses the Great, Mesopotamia and Egypt, those old cultures and civilizations, entered into a period of slow but steady decline, which allowed for other small kingdoms and mighty empires to arise. The first group to challenge the old established civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt were a mysterious group of people whom the Egyptians referred to as the Sea Peoples. The hieroglyphs for these mysterious invaders are sea and people. Therefore, modern historians call them the Sea Peoples. We don't know anything about the Sea Peoples, where they came from, anything about their culture or habits. All we know is that the Egyptians referred to them as the Sea Peoples, so one would assume that they came from the Red Sea or the Mediterranean Sea and attacked various locations in Egypt as well as Mesopotamia. But even the Sea Peoples did not stick around for long. All of these groups, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Egypt's old enemies, the Hittites defeated by Ramses the Great, and the Sea Peoples, fell to a mighty empire which arose, called Assyria. Assyria would fall after dominating the Middle East for a short period of time to the Persians. But in the midst of Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations, as a part of the Assyrian and the Persian empires, were a small group of people called the Hebrews, and it is with the Hebrews that we start today. What we know about the Hebrews comes largely from the Old Testament of the Bible. The earliest parts of the Bible were written between 950 BC and 800 BC, and what we know about the Hebrews comes from their historical and religious text called the Old Testament. Historians are hesitant to use any religious document, including the Old Testament of the Bible, as historical fact. Historians often look for outside, non-religious sources to corroborate stories from the Bible. If they find evidence outside of the Bible to prove those stories, then they accept them as real, true accounts. Otherwise, the Old Testament is regarded by historians as being a combination of myth and legend and some history thrown in there. Now, that may be a new concept for some of you who are listening to this lecture, who have been brought up and raised on the idea that the Old Testament is fact. Historians do not accept it as so. What do we know about the Hebrews? Well, history and religion often divide in this topic. So what I'll try to do is tell you when I'm talking about the historical record and when I'm talking about the Old Testament. According to the Old Testament of the Bible, the Hebrews, all of them, were descendants of a great Mesopotamian patriarch by the name of Abraham. According to historical records, around 2000 BC, there were a great deal of migrations of various groups of people in and out of Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, and even down into Egypt. It is believed that the Hebrews were a part of these migratory groups. Some Hebrews settled in Mesopotamia, some in Syria, some in Palestine, and some in Egypt. According to the Old Testament of the Bible, when the Hebrews arrived in Egypt, they were looking for food, that they were trying to escape famine that existed in other parts of the ancient Near East, and so went into Egypt, which was known as a land of plenty. And the Old Testament tells us that while some Hebrews were able to remain free, some were taken into bondage and used by the Egyptian pharaohs to build massive temples and other monuments and structures, not the pyramids. By the time the Hebrews arrived in Egypt, which would have been somewhere in the 16th century BC, most estimates say that would be the 1500s BC, the pyramids were already 1,600 years old. We should point out that there is no record of the Hebrew people in Egyptian history. They refer to some wandering nomads called the Hepiru that may or may not have been the Hebrews. There is no record in Egyptian history of the Hepiru or the Hebrews being held in bondage or in captivity. In fact, the Egyptians often prided themselves on the fact that their workers on various temples and pyramids and projects were skilled labor, paid for the work, and free workers. So history and religion divide on that particular subject. According to the Old Testament book of Exodus, some Hebrews were held in bondage or slavery in Egypt until the circa around about the 13th century BC, that would be the 1200s BC, when a great champion arose for the Hebrew people. His name was Moses, and according to the Old Testament book of Exodus, Moses was abandoned by his mother for his safety into the Nile River, where he was discovered by an Egyptian princess who rescued this baby, raised it as her own, and gave it an Egyptian name, Moses. According to Exodus, Moses grew up to be friends with the Pharaoh, was close with the Pharaoh, at least until they became adults, and then they sort of had a parting of the ways, and that was because Moses did not like the way the Egyptian Pharaoh, who was probably Ramses the Great, treated the Hebrews. According to the Old Testament of the Bible, the book of Exodus, Moses witnessed an Egyptian overseer beating severely a Hebrew, and Moses, in response to that, lost his temper and killed this Egyptian overseer. For it, Moses had to go into hiding for a while. When he returned to Egypt, he pleaded with the Pharaoh to, quote, "let my people go," and the Old Testament book of Exodus relates that various strange events and occurrences occur in Egypt, and that the Pharaoh of Egypt and his magicians and viziers, they were called, were able to repeat many of these fates, but eventually Moses was able to compel the Pharaoh to let his people go, and Moses was promised by the God of the Hebrews, called Yahweh, or later translated as Jehovah. To modern English-speaking Christians, that entity is simply God. So, according to Yahweh, or God of the Hebrews, Moses was to lead the Hebrews on a great exodus to Palestine, where some Hebrews had already settled as part of those migrations around 2000 BC. This was, in fact, to be the promised land of the Hebrews. And according to the Old Testament of the Bible, the Hebrews were led out of Egypt across the Reed Sea, not the Red Sea. That was a mistranslation that occurred from Hebrew to Greek. Moses led the Hebrews across the Reed Sea, or the Nile Delta, up into Palestine, though we know, if we're familiar with the book of Exodus, that Moses actually never made it to Palestine, but did along the way give his people the 10 Commandments by which they were to be governed. When the Hebrews finally arrived in Palestine, of course they found it inhabited by all sorts of Middle Eastern people, Philistines, Amorites, and Canaanites. And in the 13th century and 12th century and 11th century BC, there was a great deal of fighting in Palestine. The Hebrews fought a series of vicious, savage wars against the people they found living in Palestine. Around 1000 BC, a Hebrew king emerged by the name of Saul, who united 12 distinct groups of Hebrews, commonly referred to as tribes, together, and he was the first king of a unified Hebrew group. He united all of those 12 Hebrew tribes under his reign, under his leadership, and then warred with the Philistines. This war was carried on by David. David also reigned as king of the Hebrews somewhere around 1000 BC. His claim to fame historically is that he captured Jerusalem as a capital for the Hebrews. When David died, he was succeeded by Solomon, whose reign was somewhere around 965 to 925 BC. Solomon was famed for his great wisdom and his polygamy. He had many wives and concubines. Solomon wanted to build for the Hebrews temples and palaces to rival that, like those in Egypt and Mesopotamia. So the way he did this was he taxed the Hebrews very harshly to build palaces and temples, and especially a palace for himself and a temple to house one of the most important relics to the Hebrews, the Ark of the Covenant. So his harsh taxes were not popular at all, and that in fact made Solomon a bit unpopular. So he used this high tax money, these high taxes, to gain a lot of money to build a temple to house, as I said just a second ago, the Ark of the Covenant, which was, according to the Old Testament of the Bible, a stone chest emblazoned with gold, which held inside it the 10 Commandments. Solomon had a temple constructed around the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark of the Covenant had been given to the Hebrews as a sign of a contract between themselves and Yahweh. According to Yahweh, Jehovah God, in the Old Testament of the Bible, he instructed the Hebrews how to build the Ark of the Covenant and told them that so long as they remained truly monotheistic and worshipped him only and put no one before him, they would be his chosen people. Now, if you're familiar with the Old Testament of the Bible, you'll remember that when Moses came from Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments, he found some of the Hebrews messing around with and worshiping a Mesopotamian cow god called Baal. So Yahweh had told the Hebrews to build this Ark of the Covenant, to house it and to keep it safe, and according to the Old Testament of the Bible, it was purported to have magical powers. When Solomon died in 925 BC, the Hebrews divided into 2 separate nations. Solomon had not successfully unified the Hebrews. In fact, his harsh policies led them to divide. The 10 tribes who had settled in the northern part of Palestine came to be known as the nation of Israel. 10 tribes there. Their capital was at Samaria, and they practiced polytheism. Yahweh, or God, was just one of their gods. 2 tribes of Hebrew people could not stomach the thought of worshiping more gods. They stayed true to Yahweh, or Jehovah. They settled in the southern part of Palestine. Their nation came to be known as Judah, and those Hebrews were called the Jews. Their capital was at Jerusalem. After Solomon's death, the Hebrews have problems. They're divided religiously between polytheists and monotheists. Their capitals are different. They live in different locations. They do not get along well. This made it much easier for the next mighty empire to wipe them out. In fact, the next empire on the scene are the Assyrians. They invaded Palestine, wiped out Israel. Those tribes are called the 10 lost tribes because when the Assyrians came into Israel, they scattered them. No one knows to this day where those 10 tribes of Hebrews went. As the Assyrians came south into Judah, they destroyed the capital of Jerusalem, including Solomon's temple, and the Ark of the Covenant has been missing ever since. There's a great deal of speculation as to where it might be, but no one knows for sure. These 2 groups, these 2 tribes that the Assyrians found in Judah, were taken back to Babylon in Mesopotamia and held against their will in what was called the Babylonian captivity of the Jews, from 587 to 538 BC. The Assyrians, fortunately for the Hebrews, were not around very long. The Assyrians were wiped out by a tolerant and very merciful kingdom and empire called the Persians. When the Persians invaded Babylon and found the Jews in captivity, they freed them. This was done by a great Persian leader named Cyrus the Great. What we should note here is that the Hebrews had a very short-lived empire. Only during the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon did the Hebrews actually have an empire. It was short-lived, only about 100 years. They were wiped out by the Assyrians, then the Persians. Then they became a part of Alexander the Great's empire, which we'll talk about in chapter 4. They then fell to the Romans. So the significance of the Hebrews is not any long-lasting civilization or empire that they created, because they did not do so. What is important about them is that they make the most significant religious contribution in all of history. Their belief in Yahweh as a God who was not to be portrayed was a different and unique concept in the ancient world. These were the first true monotheists. Remember, Akhenaten was the first monotheist, but these were the first true monotheists, the Jews, in that they believed their God was the God of all people, not just the God of the Hebrews. The Hebrews or Jews are also significant for writing the Old Testament of the Bible and the Ten Commandments. The Old Testament and the Ten Commandments are the foundation of Judaism. That's what we call the modern-day religion of the Hebrews. It's also the foundation for Christianity and Islam. The Hebrews believed that it was their duty to maintain their covenant or contract with Yahweh and remain His chosen people. They were not, however, evangelical, meaning in ancient times they did not go out and seek converts. The next area that we're going to briefly talk about is the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were Mesopotamians. They grew up in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. As Mesopotamia began to decline, one group of Mesopotamians saw an opportunity. These were a group of people who lived in the city-state of Assyria, therefore they're called the Assyrians. Their capital was on the upper Tigris River at a place called Nineveh. Nineveh is the capital of Assyria. Assyria was a city-state in Mesopotamia. The Assyrians were Mesopotamian people, meaning that they were Mesopotamian in culture and religion. You can refer back to your notes from chapter 1 as to what we mean here, but basically, long story short, the Assyrian people worshipped all of the Mesopotamian gods that we talked about before. They knew the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example. They also followed Hammurabi's law code. So the Assyrians are a Mesopotamian people who saw an opportunity to take over Mesopotamia because of its weakness. This empire flourished from the 9th century BC to the 7th century BC. In other words, the 800s BC to the 600s BC, only about 200 years. The height of this empire was reached during the reign of a king named Sargon II, who reigned from 721 to 705 BC. During the reign of Sargon II, the Assyrian Empire included all of Mesopotamia, down south through Syria and Palestine. And I'll remind you, as we just said, when the Assyrians came into Palestine, they found it, of course, occupied by 12 Hebrew tribes. 10 in the northern part, living in Israel, were wiped out and scattered. The other 2 were taken back to Babylonia from Israel. Then the Assyrians marched straight down into Egypt and conquered Egypt all the way down to the city of Thebes. That's far down on the Nile River. So the significance of the Assyrian Empire is that despite the fact that it was short-lived, only about 200 years did it last, it was significant because it was the first empire to unite both Egypt and Mesopotamia. In other words, Assyria is important because it brings together what had been 2 separate civilizations. Egypt and Mesopotamia had developed separately, but they're unified by the Assyrians. This was done because the Assyrians had a mighty military in the ancient world, the best the ancient world had seen. Their army included infantry, cavalry, archers, war chariots, engineers, spies, and they were known for their brutality. It was quite common that when the Assyrians attacked a particular area in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or in between Syria and Palestine, they would often wipe people out by shooting them with their arrows. They would also run them over with their war chariots, decapitating and mangling them in the process. And they also, was kind of gross, practiced cannibalism. So the Assyrians were feared because of their brutal tactics. And eventually, the people living in these conquered areas realized this brutality is ridiculous. The Assyrians are a minority in their own empire. All of the rest of us who are being treated so badly actually outnumber them, so why don't we gang up on them? So Assyria's downfall was rather quick because of their brutality and overexpansion. They got too big too fast. They weren't able to hold on to such a vast territory, and because they were a minority in their own empire, they were defeated by those they had just conquered. And the two areas that led the defeat of the Assyrians were the Babylonians from Babylon and Mesopotamia, and a new group we haven't yet talked about called the Medes, who were from Iran. And that brings us to our last topic in this lecture, and that is the Persian Empire. The Persians came out of Russia and Central Asia sometime around 1000 BC and settled into what we would recognize on a modern-day map as the country of Iran. Until recent modern times, the country of Iran was known as Persia for the people who settled it around 1000 BC. Around 1000 BC, Persians from Russia and Central Asia migrated south and settled into Iran. The Persians broke into two separate and distinct tribes. Now, they're all Persians, but they have two different names. One group of the Persians was called simply the Persians, and they settled in the south and were farmers. In the north, the Persians were called the Medes, and they were nomadic horse breeders. These two groups developed their own distinct separate ways of life and had their own tribal leaders until 559 BC. In 559 BC, the Persians had a great king by the name of Cyrus. Cyrus desired to be more than king of just the Persians, so he united the Persians and the Medes, in other words, brought all the Persians together under his leadership. So in the first few years of his reign, which was from 559 to 530 BC, Cyrus the Great united all of the Persians, or all of Persia. He had under his control both the Persians and the Medes. Cyrus is known in ancient history as Cyrus the Great. Why was he so great? Well, because of the extent of his empire, which was huge. What Cyrus did was to conquer Mesopotamia and Egypt, Syria and Palestine. Essentially, he conquered the Assyrian Empire, added to it Persia. He went farther east away from Persia, right to the boundary of the modern-day country of India. He also turned westward from Mesopotamia and conquered areas today that we would recognize as Turkey and just north of Greece. So Cyrus's empire was huge. It was the biggest that the ancient world had seen to this date. It was a vast, huge empire. And it is true that Cyrus was a conqueror, but he was merciful and tolerant. Whenever Cyrus the Great invaded a particular location, he gave the people a choice: cooperate and enjoy the benefits of being part of the Persian Empire, or resist and be crushed. Most people chose to join this empire voluntarily to avoid warfare. Cyrus used native people, such as the Egyptians, to continue to rule Egypt. He did not demand that people lay down, in other words, and take domination by the Persians. He allowed these various groups to continue to have their own religious and cultural practices and to rule themselves. He was not concerned with complete and total domination. All he wanted from his vast territory, which was united by a long stretch of road called the Royal Road, was that they paid him tribute and loyalty. So Cyrus was known for being merciful and tolerant, and a perfect example of this is his treatment of the Hebrews. When he invaded Babylonia in Mesopotamia, he found the Jews held captive there. He freed them, told them to go back to Israel, back to their homeland of Israel and Judah. And for this, Cyrus is even called the Great by the Hebrews in the Old Testament of the Bible. They referred to him as a savior, as a great rescuer, whereas they had talked about the Assyrian peoples as a brutal, hated people. So he was known as the Great because he was merciful, tolerant, and had a vast empire. His empire's success relied heavily on a mighty military, which he copied the regiments from the Assyrian army and added to it a new group called the Immortals. But, unlike the Assyrians, Cyrus and the Persians did not practice such brutal tactics as running people over and decapitating them, burying them up to the sand, up to their neck in the sand, pulling their heads off and then eating them. They didn't do any of that stuff. So, by comparison, they were much more tolerant and merciful. His mighty empire rested on a particular group of specially trained and specially privileged soldiers, the best of the best in the ancient world, sort of like our Navy SEALs today. They were called the Immortals, so called because their numbers were always kept at precisely 10,000. These were the best, most highly trained and specialized soldiers that the ancient world had seen, and they were very important in the army of the Persians and largely responsible for the success of that empire. After Cyrus died, he was succeeded by Darius or Darius and Xerxes. Darius is spelled D-A-R-I-U-S, and Xerxes is spelled X-E-R-X-E-S. Darius or Darius and Xerxes attempted to add Greece to the Persian Empire, and that's when things go badly for Persia. If they had left Greece alone, their empire would have been much longer lived than it was. As we'll see in chapters 3 and 4, it is Greece that brings down the mighty Persian Empire. More about that later. Our last topic for the Persians is to talk a little bit about their religion. The Persians were originally polytheistic, but somewhere around 600 BC, an important figure by the name of Zoroaster, Z-O-R-O-A-S-T-E-R, also known as Zarathustra, Z-A-R-A-T-H-U-S-T-R-A. Two names, one guy. Zoroaster lived around 600 BC, and we know about his life and his teachings from a collection of hymns and poems called the Zend Avesta, Z-E-N-D-A-V-E-S-T-A. The Zend Avesta was a collection of hymns and poems about Zoroaster and his religious beliefs, which were monotheistic. Zoroaster told the Persian people and won converts, including Cyrus the Great, that they had two choices in life: the good path or the bad path. The good path included being a good, moral, upright person and worshiping just one God called Arha Mazda, A-H-U-R-A-M-A-Z-D-A. So if, according to Zoroaster, the Persians worshipped one God alone, Arha Mazda, they would be rewarded with heaven, a paradise, everlasting. If they followed the bad path and were terrible people with no sense of right or wrong and or practiced polytheism, they would be punished forever in hell, which he envisioned as a deep, dark pit full of flames. And many have said that that had influence on the later Christians who had a tendency to view hell in the same way, that they possibly got this idea from Zoroaster. Zoroaster also told the Persians that they had free will, the ability to choose which path they would follow. And he believed that when every individual died, they would be put up for a last judgment. They would have to meet Arha Mazda, and he would decide whether that person got heaven or hell. So, that concludes our lecture on Chapter 2, Small Kingdoms and Mighty Empires.